Hi, I'm Hannah Nepilova, an integrative counsellor, and welcome to Therapy Chats, the podcast where I talk to specialists from different fields of mental health. My guest today is Tracy Keating, a psychotherapist with over 20 years' experience in the field. She previously served as head of student wellbeing at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, otherwise known as RADA, where she led a team of 8 therapists supporting students' mental health in a high-pressure artistic environment. She now offers private therapy and supervision, drawing on a person-centered and humanistic approach with additional training in EMDR therapy. I mean, so much I want to ask you, really, but maybe the
Sure.
next thing would be to find out a little bit about how you, decided to go and work with artists and how you came to start working at RADA.
Sure. So I actually trained at RADA back in the mists of time. So I did the acting course at RADA and worked as an actor for 10 years. So that's my background. Then retrained as a therapist, qualified in 2004. And I kept in touch with Pat Myers, who was the registrar at RADA for many years, amazing woman. And so, yeah, we'd keep in touch, and she knew what I was doing. And I remember I was on holiday. I just had lunch and I was dozing on the beach, and I got a phone call going, "Darling," and it was Pat going, "Yes, our counselor has left, has finished up working with us. Would you like to come in and work with our students?" And so I said, "Oh my goodness, yes, that sounds really interesting."
And kind of
Um,
perfect because you knew the world. You
well,
understood.
exactly. That's it. I knew the world and I knew the training. So I did sessional counseling work with students for about 2 years. And then Pat was retiring and a new registrar came in, Julie Crofts. And Julie and Ed, who was the principal at the time, sort of said, we've been thinking about how we can manage student support, and do you have any ideas? I said, "Well, yes, I do. You could have like a student support service." I mean, they had the student and academic services, but, more of the well-being side. I said, "Yes, you could have a group of counselors. We could offer placements to trainees." And they sort of said, "Well, that sounds great. Would you like to do it?" So that's kind of how it started. It was all very organic. It all kind of developed in a very organic way. And I was kind of given this freedom to develop a service, which was, a wonderful position to be in.
So you really
And then
was your baby.
it was my baby, Hannah. It was my baby. Yes, I'm very proud of my baby. And then they created the role head of student wellbeing, because that role hadn't existed before. So we kind of grew it from scratch, really. And I had a wonderful colleague. I'd taught counselling at City Lit in London for about 10 years, and a lovely colleague from there, Paulette Gibson. And I said, "Paulette, I'm taking on this role at RADA. Would you come with me?" So she was like the senior counselor in the service and the clinical supervisor for the trainees. She was wonderful. And so what we did was we just kind of grew the service as needed. We needed somebody to support some students who needed help with maybe drug and alcohol issues. And so we it was a wonderful counselor. Janie Murray was working in as a drug and alcohol service in Camden, and she came in. So I mean, we grew the service to about 6 qualified counselors and then 2 or 3 trainees.
Mhm.
Um, and it grew over the course of about two years.
Gosh.
Yeah,
Okay. And
yeah.
what I'm really curious about is how different was your work at RADA from what you had been doing before with clients? Were there different issues that
Interesting.
come up?
Yes, yes. I mean, I had done quite a lot of work with young people. I'd worked at Brook Sexual Health Service for young people up to the age of 25. I'd worked as a therapist there for 7 years. So I was quite used to working with young people. I'd also worked in a school, but they would be younger. I tend to forget places that I've worked on because there's been so many. What I was really struck by was the sense of coming home when I started working at RADA, and how similar it still was to how it was when I was there. And just this sense of, oh yes, this is very familiar. I know this. Initially, the majority of the students who accessed the service were acting students, but then we put quite a bit of work into encouraging more of the technical students to access the service. But certainly working with the acting students, it just felt like you had this shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I understood the training. The training, I mean, had been developed, but in its ethos was essentially very similar.
Mm-hmm.
The contact hours are incredibly long. It's very demanding. The students are incredibly highly driven. One of the things we put in place was a section in the library on well-being, and we had some kind of bibliotherapy books, and I had multiple copies of Overcoming Perfectionism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, because I mean, I
Yes.
was going to ask, were the issues that came up, obviously
Mm,
in vague terms, for for confidentiality
mm,
reasons,
mm,
were the issues that came up primarily related to, people's work well, in the arts as that
mm,
say,
mm.
or did they tend to be
Not
completely unrelated?
particularly. Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, people sort of say, oh, I imagine you dealt with a lot of performance anxiety. And actually, performance anxiety was something that didn't really come up
Mm,
because for these young people, performing is their safe space.
interesting.
It's the place where they feel often most themselves. Um, so the presenting issues were pretty much like any service anywhere. And,
Really?
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And a lot of the young people, the students, they had quite complex backgrounds, complex family backgrounds. And that would have been I'd say the predominant theme would be
Because
working through and kind of adverse childhood experiences that would, so um yeah, and I mean, yes, perfectionism and anxiety and worrying about whether they were good enough. um I'd see like three students one after the other, and they might be all in the same year, and they'd be saying, oh my God, everybody in my year is so wonderful and I'm dreadful and I'm not as good as anybody. And then the next person would come in and say exactly the same thing.
gosh,
And
and
yeah,
it
and
really
part
gives you an idea of how much people, compare their insides to other people's outsides. And yeah.
100%. And some of the work was really encouraging them to speak to each other and to confide in each other. I think, I mean, my sense is of, I don't know, is it Gen Z? They've grown up with social media and kind of presenting themselves online. And I think for some of that generation, it can be hard to confide worries and insecurities.
You think
But
more so
they,
the previous generations.
well, I do compare them, say, to my generation, where all we did was give out and, yeah, kind of moan about our lives and how,
Mm.
I mean, no, that's not all we did, but I think we were very comfortable with being messy with each other, maybe in a way that. But having said that, I mean,
Whereas now we have to sort of feel like we have to curate ourselves because
I
as we
think there's a lot more of that. Yeah, I think that. I mean, and if you've been drip fed that from adolescence, it goes in, even if people intellectually know that people are curating their feeds or whatever, and that's not how their lives actually are, of course, that's what you're seeing all the time. It's going to have an impact. But the students, I mean, they would form really deep friendships and very supportive friendships with each other. They really would. And quite often, once the service got developed and was very embedded, and RADA was incredibly supportive of the wellbeing service and the faculty. I mean, it was a huge relief for the faculty, because if they had any worries, they could, suggest to a student, or why don't you go and have a chat with the wellbeing team? Or they could mention to me, oh, I'm a little worried about this student. And I'd say, okay, great. I'll just reach out and I'll just invite them in for a chat. So it would all be very informal. But students would refer each other to the service. And sometimes a student would turn up at the door with their friend and say, they're really struggling. And I sort of said that they should come and speak with you. So the service was very embedded in the organization, which I think really helped. And it kind of worked both ways. So obviously the students, there was very good take up for the service, but also we did training we encouraged therapists with a background in performance to join the service, but also we did training. So like the deputy head of the technical department at RADA did a training for the counsellors and explained what a technical rehearsal was and how that worked. And all the counsellors had tours of RADA, and particularly, like the scenic art studio, the construction studio, the lighting department, the sound department, so that they really had an understanding of what the students were doing.
What goes on. And I was going to ask, to what extent did your own background as an actor help you or inform the way you worked with them?
I think it really did help. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't get into talking about the students' work with them. They had all their tutors for that. But just in terms of how they managed the work emotionally and psychologically. Like, for example, sometimes you'd have a student go, I've got a really small part in this show. And I remember sort of saying a couple of times, I said, the thing is, if you really only have like one small scene, I said, you had that big part and you will have another big part. I said, it's probably important not to try and put everything that you've learned about acting into your one small scene, because that's just going to make you feel quite tense and put a lot of pressure on yourself. I said, you can probably take your foot off the gas for this one and maybe rest a little bit, because you will have another big part in the next round of shows. So it's that kind of, it's something just about pacing yourself.
Been there and done it. You could speak from experience. You could speak with some authority about that.
I guess so. Yeah.
And what about in terms of the qualities that you need as an actor? Do you think they lend themselves to being a counselor?
Oh, I think so. I think so. Absolutely. Well, I mean, the way we were taught, we were kind of method trained, really. And so you're really making that imaginative leap into somebody else's experiential world. And when I was training as a therapist, I was struck by the similarities, and that served me quite well. That felt very natural to kind of step into somebody else's frame of reference and kind of look through their windscreen, as it were, looking out on their world. That it did, for me, it felt quite natural. And the therapy training itself, I remember thinking, my goodness, this kind of feels like acting training in a lot of ways. There's so much personal development, as you know, involved therapy training, and being with a group of people and getting to know each other really well, and the wonderful friendships that you form, or some of the tensions that you can feel in the group, that there were so many
And learning to let
similarities.
your guard down around.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Being vulnerable, risking, being open. We did quite a lot of personal in because I did the certificate in person-centered counselling at City Lit, and we had a personal development group um, every week, and that was just all about being authentic and responding to others authentically. And then, of course, afterwards, then after I'd qualified, I facilitated personal development groups at City Lit. So you're really kind of encouraging people to take those risks and be authentically themselves in relation to others.
It's
Yeah.
fascinating. I wonder if it's if you're if that ability to step into somebody else's shoes and see the world through their windscreen, as you say, if
Mm.
it's so highly developed that it make it harder to challenge.
Well, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting one. I think for me as a therapist, if I sort of feel, that I'd like to, I'll very deliberately kind of step out of their frame of reference and say that I'm doing that. I'll sort of say, I'm having, and I'll use my congruence because I am, I'm quite person-centered in how I practice. I'll sort of say, I'm having a thought about something, and I realize now this is coming from my perspective, but would would it be helpful if I were to share something that I was thinking? So I think so long as you're very explicit, that something you're sharing is from your perspective, rather than just really empathically understanding and reflecting back that understanding to the to
Maybe
the to
it's
the
a little bit like when you get to the end of a play and you go back into being yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was something we worked with the students on, de-rolling,
De-rolling. Yes,
actually.
exactly. It's de-rolling.
Yeah, because so much of their work was around, and obviously this is the acting students, so much of their work is around getting into the character and finding that character and inhabiting. But there wasn't so much work about how to get out of the character again. And what we found, and I certainly found as myself as an actor, that I could quite comfortably split myself in two, so I could be myself and be the character and go between them. Where it gets really challenging is if you're rehearsing a show during the day and then performing a different one in the evening.
Mm.
So then you've got to inhabit three identities,
Yes.
And
Yourself
so
in the
we use
middle. Yeah.
exactly. So we gave them some kind of de-rolling exercises, how they could kind of come back to themselves and maybe use kind of items of clothing or jewelry or whatever that to kind of help them make that transition and to kind of shake off the character, because otherwise they would be in that kind of semi-character state all the time. And that was also important for the technical students because they would be, and some of the plays were very challenging, some very intense themes. So if you've got a student who's, say, operating the lighting desk, they're going to be sitting in on some of the rehearsals, they're going to be in the technical rehearsal, and then they're seeing every show, and it could be really quite challenging material, and it was just as important for them to be able to kind of de-roll and leave it behind and kind of come back to themselves and
Yeah.
their own lives.
I,
Yeah.
and I wonder if some of those experiences could have been actually quite potentially traumatic.
Oh yes, there could be quite a lot of triggering material. Yeah.
Triggering material, or actually re-traumatizing
Yes.
if some of the
Yeah.
students had come from difficult,
Absolutely.
had
Yeah.
had difficult experiences in the past.
Yeah. So students, both acting and technical, were asked if they were happy to work on a particular show. But that's difficult because, that show could represent an opportunity for them, which they mightn't want to turn down. So that was something that we gave a lot, to help to prevent students becoming re-traumatized or to experience, vicarious trauma, where actually just being exposed to the material, regularly for an intense period of time could potentially. And actually, the head of acting training, Lucy Skilbeck, asked me to develop a workshop, which is working with challenging material, and to deliver that to acting and technical students in their third year. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So that, I mean, that was an area of work that we had to pay a lot of attention to.
Yes,
Yeah.
imagine. And I guess this ties into another question of mine, which is sort of whether you develop certain techniques for working with actors, or what techniques that you found were very effective for working with actors and lighting students and technicians.
Interesting. Um, I mean, the counselors who came to work at the service, they loved working with the students, and they were always struck by how open they were. And I remember when we were developing the service, and we'd have our regular team meetings, and the therapist was saying, usually it takes about 3 months to get to the point in the work, and these students are getting there within 2 or 3 sessions.
Mm.
So I'm not sure if we developed particular techniques. I mean, we would have. Say that again.
Approaches,
Uh, think we had a range of approach. I mean, I would say the core approach of the service was humanistic.
Mhm.
We had a wonderful therapist who specialized with any body image and eating disorders. We were very lucky. We didn't have many students at RADA with serious eating disorders, but we were on it. If anybody expressed issues around body image, or that they'd had a previous experience of eating disorder, we were quite vigilant about that. And she was trained in cognitive analytical therapy, so CAT, which I mean, Hannah, don't ask me too much about it because I wouldn't be able to tell you. But I know that it's the approach that is used, I think, mostly in eating disorder services. And Emma Walton is her name, had 15 years experience of working in eating disorder service. So that was a very specific approach that was used with students. And Emma was so gorgeous that the students loved coming to see her, which is great, because people quite often, if there's anything around an eating disorder, they can be quite reluctant to seek support. And again, they would recommend to their friend that they go and see Emma as well. So that was wonderful. I'd say the core approach was pretty humanistic, which seemed to work very well with the students. They mostly just needed a space to process, and then to kind of think about, how to manage the stresses and strains of the training.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I wonder if you were, this is very hard, I think a very hard question to answer in a way, but I think if you were going to sum up what the most important lesson was that you learned from those years of working in the service and putting
Oh,
it together, what do you think it would be?
I would say collaboration.
Mhm.
It was a very collaborative service. I mean, an extraordinary group of people who we all still meet up. We're all very, very fond of each other, but also between the service and the rest of the academy. We really worked very closely with members of faculty and members of senior leadership team. So it was very collaborative, and it was all based on kind of relationship and trust, really, and communication. Yeah, but it was a hugely collaborative experience, which was just incredibly rich. I mean, there was a lot of stress, and also, I mean, we had the pandemic during those years. I'd say collaborative and adaptability, because we certainly had to be very adaptive during COVID.
Yes,
Everybody
you
in the
would, and making
academy,
that
everybody.
transition to doing things online,
I mean,
delivering therapy online.
yeah, we
Mm.
moved the whole service online within a week.
Gosh, within a week, crikey.
Within a week. I was so proud of us.
That
And
is
most of us
amazing.
hadn't done online therapy before. And then I remember is it Eventbrite? They started delivering very quickly trainings for therapists who were adapting to online work. So we were all able to do that online training. And of course, we'd be meeting regularly. Uh, yeah. So, I mean, the whole academy had to change how it practiced.
Gosh, yes.
Um,
And I remember at the
yeah.
time, Zoom was just coming in, wasn't it, then?
Absolutely, we'd never heard of Zoom. We were really lucky. Our student wellbeing advisor, fantastic therapist, Chris Alderton, he did his placement with us and stayed on. He had a background in IT. I mean, it was such a gift.
Mm.
And he was saying, there's this thing called Zoom, and we need to get it, and I'll show you how to use it. Amazing. Amazing. And that's not that long ago, but it
It's just,
feels like
it's become a verb, hasn't it? To Zoom.
to Zoom. Exactly. Exactly. So yes, I guess that those would be the lessons: collaboration and
Adaptability
adaptability.
and I mean
Yeah.
collaboration. Gosh, I mean, because I think with therapy, you can sometimes feel so lonely with the material that you're handling, can't
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. And I have always liked working within a team. And most of my work now is private practice. And I am
That
missing that. Yeah.
mm, I
Yeah.
can imagine,
Yeah.
and we have peer supervision and supervision, but I suppose it's not
Yes.
quite the same as being part of a team. You feel like sort of
Exactly.
surrounded by a body of people who kind of have your back.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Totally. Totally.
I can
Yeah.
imagine. Gosh. Well, I mean, Tracy, I could ask all sorts of other things, but you've given me so much to chew over
Good.
already, and it's really fascinating, especially, I mean, so interesting hearing about those parallels between the world of acting and the world of
Yes.
therapy, and actually
Yeah.
how they complement each other.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
you're so well placed to do this, and also and delivering therapy to actors, of course, who anyway
Yeah.
you'll be very sort of simpatico with.
Absolutely. Yes. I understand the stresses and the strains of that world and the insecurity and the challenge of holding on to a sense of yourself, while your career might be going through peaks and troughs. Yes.
Mm. Yeah, and
Yes.
yourself and your self-worth.
Indeed. Yeah.
Gosh. Well, thank you so much, Tracy, for giving up your time to.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me. I've been really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more of the same, then feel free to subscribe to our podcast or visit our YouTube channel at Kent House Counselling.